Five.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the most merciful. All praise is due to Allah, and may His peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wherever you may be, whatever time it may be, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and the blessings of Allah be upon you and upon all your loved ones, Ya Rabbal Alameen. And thank you for joining us on the first Thursday of October. Let's talk about it. Pleasure to have the company of my two sisters, Sister Suhad Dweik, soon to be a licensed MFT, inshallah, and Sister Emily Oqlah, soon to be Dr. Oqlah, inshallah, very soon. It's good to have both of you on board this evening. And as always, thank you for joining us. And Emily, take it. What are we talking about this evening, inshallah?
Thank you for the introduction, Sheikh, and assalamu alaikum to everyone listening. Tonight, we're talking about hurting at home. And within that, talking about domestic abuse. To start us off, I want to give a trigger warning. These are some topics that might be kind of hard to hear or hurtful to listen to. So if there's at any time that it feels like it's too much or it feels unsafe to listen or to be here, feel free to pause. You can come back to the video later, or you can leave entirely.
And Emily, what do you mean by that? I mean, sometimes, I know we said this before and we gave this warning before, and you said that if you find the presentation triggering, what are we talking about when we make these statements?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for example, someone who might be currently experiencing abuse or violence in the household or even outside of the household in whatever relationship or environment it might exist in, hearing some of these topics and some of these words might feel very overwhelming, and potentially it could lead to maybe a panic attack to deal with right now, especially if there aren't support systems in place or a phone number to call or a safe place to go to when someone's feeling overwhelmed. It could be even that you experienced this in the past and maybe you're not currently experiencing it, but it's still kind of overwhelming or hard to hear and could trigger you to feel panic or anxiety or depression or some hard feelings based off past experiences. It could also be that you yourself didn't experience it, but maybe you witnessed abuse or you witnessed violence growing up in your household.
And I think Emily is freezing. No, we lost you there for a second.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But I think we're getting the gist of what you're saying. I'm not sure if Suha, if you followed that as well. And that is, if you're feeling or you're feeling that, sensing that listening to this is too difficult for you, we're just asking you to practice some self-care.
Absolutely.
Got it. Okay.
So when we talk about abuse, there are different levels of abuse that we are mentioning. Domestic abuse includes child abuse, it includes elder abuse, and it includes spousal abuse, or what is referred to as intimate partner violence, or IPV. And so domestic abuse can really relate to all of these things. And sometimes when we hear domestic abuse, we might think one example only, but it's important to take note that especially within a family or within a household, there are various levels of abuse that can occur. Suha, was there anything you wanted to add to this?
First of all, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm really glad to be here and that we're having these conversations. But yeah, going off of what you said, Emily, with there are different types of abuse. So there's child abuse, there's elder abuse, and there's spousal abuse. And I think today's topic, we're going to be focusing mostly on the spousal abuse or interpersonal partner violence. And, from just overall, I think when it comes to domestic abuse, when we think of that, what do we mean? So really, it's just a pattern of coercive control or intimidation. It could be like trying to isolate, mainly trying to have control or use threat of physical violence in order to basically exert your power over somebody. So that's what we talk about by domestic abuse. And there are, within the interpersonal partner violence, we can see different types of abuse as well. So, there's the psychological or emotional, verbal abuse, there's physical or sexual abuse, and then there's financial or economic abuse. Mm-hmm. And, if we're going to talk a little bit about maybe the psychological, emotional, or verbal, there's, many people might think, hey, he's never physically hit me, so I don't think that it's abuse. But really, the psychological and emotional aspect of it can be just as traumatizing and just as damaging. And that can include things like name calling or yelling, maybe insulting the person, or threatening to take away something, or threatening harms. Maybe a lot of times you see the threat of taking away the kids, or taking away that kind of, something that's really important to the victim. A lot of times too, with psychological, it can just be limiting or limiting the person's social circle, even imitating or mocking them. And obviously, when it comes to the verbal aspect, to the psychological aspect too, it's a lot of isolating. And, I don't know if you want to add something to that, Emily or Sheikh Fazaga.
I think just to contextualize what we're doing here, as our viewers know, that this is the month of October, and it's the 1st of October, and it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I think most of us know, and we believe that the very first line of defense for any individual is the family, the place where we feel loved and cared and valued and validated. The place where we're supposed to feel safest is at home. And sometimes, sadly, that is not the case for all people. And I hope that as we are bringing, this is part of what we like to do, the whole notion of destigmatizing these topics and openly talking about them, educating the public, offering support to individuals who may be going through this, facilitating programs, policies that would help people who are in these situations. That is really what we're doing. And please remember, we do acknowledge that a good family is not a problem-free family. They really don't exist. What we're saying is that we are a good family once we have the courage to be able to face the issues that we are facing, and also the humility to ask for help when we need to. And a good family is a family that knows that we've got an issue going on, and we're just looking for whether we have the proper tools to address the problems that we have, or we don't. And like I said, sometimes, even though it is our very first and last line of defense, a place where we're supposed to feel safest, sometimes we don't feel safe. And like you indicated, Emily and Suha, sometimes we don't feel safe physically because there is violence going on. Sometimes we don't feel safe psychologically because of the type of the different psychological abuse that may be taking place. Sometimes we just emotionally we become very damaged because of this. And I know that as a faith community, family is really important. The idea of take care of your parents, the idea of take care of your children, the idea of take care of the elderly, the idea of, and I love the fact that in the hereafter, one of the blessings of paradise, may we all be of the people of paradise, is family reunions. It's like, what part of what makes Jannah is family reunion. So I just want to make sure that we contextualize for our viewers and our audience, why is it that we are bringing up this topic, and how Islamically that topic is, and how relevant that topic is. And just one last point before we proceed. Also part of the stigma that we want to address is that many times we feel that these issues do not happen in our community, or we believe that, you know what, domestic violence does not, you know, Muslims don't go through that. These are only issues that happens to non-Muslims. And as we will learn, inshallah, we bring up these topics because we do see them. And, you know, in our capacity here as clinicians, we can all tell you about the stories that we have witnessed that were brought to our attention, taking place, you know, in our own community, in Muslim households. So please, that we want to make sure that we're being sensitive, but at the same time, we also really want to talk about it openly, honestly, frankly, and as accurately as possible, inshallah.
Yeah, and I think Sheikh Fazaga brings up a good point that there's a lot of myths surrounding domestic abuse and domestic violence, and that's something that we'll spend a little bit of time on later. But I think first we wanted to go over some statistics of what even domestic abuse or domestic violence looks like and how prevalent it really is. Because I think a lot of times there's a lot of a secrecy maybe around domestic violence. There's a lot of shame and stigma against speaking out or telling friends or family. So, you know, even myself, I these statistics are eye-opening to see just how prevalent domestic violence really is. Domestic violence looks like and how prevalent it really is. Because I think a lot of times there's a lot of
So looking at some of the stats, I don't know if we're losing Emily with her
You
connection.
go for it, Suha. Yep, go for
Just
it.
looking at some of the stats, you know, like some of them are pretty staggering. So 15.5 million children live in families where violence has occurred. And this is nationally. Then you have 7 million children who have witnessed severe violence. So we're not talking about, you know, the physical, the emotional or psychological. This is where there's like, you know, bone breaking and things that are really severe. That's a lot of children to go through something like that or witness that. You have in the most comprehensive study that has been recently done, it's saying that 15.5 million women and 830,000 men were victims of intimate partner violence. And that's a lot of people. So it's a very prevalent issue. I don't know if we can go to the next slide, but of the victims, you know, 85% of domestic abuse victims are women. But that's not to say that men are not victims. Men are also victims of domestic abuse. It's just not as common as women. It also shows, and I thought this was a really eye-opening statistic, but a woman or a victim will attempt 7 times to leave an abusive relationship before they actually do leave it. So if you think about that, 7 times, I mean, the amount of thought and effort and reluctance that comes into that is just immense. And, you know, before they successfully leave an abusive relationship. And another statistic which I thought was really interesting, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about stigma, but worldwide, it's estimated that between 8 to 67% of women are physically assaulted in their lifetime. And you can tell the range in that is just huge. And that's due to, you know, just being underreported, different countries kind of having different, I guess, thresholds for what domestic abuse is, but that range is really big, and that really goes to kind of why people don't report it as much, and that statistic.
So I'm jumping in because I'm sorry, and there must be a lot of people in my neighborhood on the internet tonight, and it's slowing me up some. But I wanted to add a point in terms of stigma when it comes to domestic abuse, especially for men compared to women, and that overall there's such stigma against speaking out. But I think men, while they make up a smaller percentage of victims of domestic abuse, there's almost a greater stigma there for men to speak out, to say, Maybe I'm experiencing physical violence or I'm experiencing sexual violence. And so I wanted to just touch on maybe some different experiences when it comes to stigma.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so
Go
Suhan,
ahead.
I found some really great some research statistics specifically for the Muslim community when it comes to domestic violence. And so the stats that we just went over are from a national sample inclusive of many types of people. And these statistics are based off of Muslim communities in the United States. So we see that 31% of American Muslims reported experiencing abuse within an intimate partner relationship, and 53% of American Muslims reported experiencing some form of domestic violence during their lifetime. And again, these are, fairly large numbers and staggering numbers when you reflect on 53% of American Muslims report experiencing domestic violence.
Yeah, just in case, sometimes I know that in our community, people are a bit sensitive about the usage of words such as intimate partner relationships. So remember, we are reporting the relationships as they are, not necessarily as they should be. So this is what's going on. So we would have loved to say that these are families in Islamic relationships, but the idea here is that it is a relationship. So when we refer to these relationships, it's not a matter of approval of the content of the relationship, but it is what it is, and Muslims are involved in it, and that is why we are talking about it in such vague terms to include any relationship with the intimate partner taking place there. But like you said, Emily, these things really do happen within our community. We are not necessarily immune by virtue of being Muslims. Somehow that does not mean that we don't face these problems. So here you have it. Numbers don't lie, and that is why we're talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add to that, I think I think we touched a little bit about the types of abuse, but this is a really interesting stat that kind of reflects those types of the type of abuse and in relation to the Muslim communities. As can see, the highest one is emotional or verbal abuse, which we kind of went over, and that being 82%. But then physical abuse, which is what I think most people kind of traditionally think of when they think of domestic abuse. So that's, hitting or punching, strangling, that kind of behavior. But then there's financial abuse, which I thought was really interesting. And that's a really high percentage. You're looking at 65%. And those are situations that, include maybe the victim is not allowed to go to work, or their money is limited, even stolen. Maybe they don't have access to money or resources, or when they do have money, many times like they are kind of asked to account for every single penny that they spent. So that sometimes people, especially people in these relationships, might be rationalizing that, but that is a version of financial abuse. So just thought thought that was really interesting to see in the Muslim community kind of the percentages of these types of abuses.
Mm-hmm. And 37% of specifically for this study, 2,000 Muslim women survivors of domestic violence were surveyed, and 37% reported multiple types of abuse. And so I think that's also important to highlight, is that you may experience more than one type of abuse, or you may witness more than one type of abuse.
And I think again, a part of why we do what we do here is, I think it's really important that and I know you mentioned this, Suha, when you said that the way that we speak is that the recipient of the abuse are mostly women, which is true, 85%, and we've got 15% of the recipients of that abuse are men. And in our deen, in Islam, what we are truly hoping for is this notion of, you want to be there as a community, where the Prophet ﷺ says, "Unsur akhaka zaliman aw mazluman." Be there for your brother, be they the oppressors or the oppressed. So people said, Prophet of Allah, we know we ought to be there when we see somebody being oppressed, but how are we to be there for the oppressor? And the Prophet ﷺ said that you stop them from their oppression. And that is precisely why we are doing what we are doing, is that we want to let the victims out there know that what is taking place does not represent us, does not represent our deen. It is not part of the teachings of our deen. And we want the perpetrators to say, look, that does not make you any better or stronger. It may give you the illusion of control and power, but that does not make you a better person or a stronger person. And we would say that we are also here to help you so that you stop this type of behavior, because it is not befitting. Your family deserves better. Your children deserve better. You as a believer, you deserve to be better in your behavior than what you are giving your own family. And to us, this is not really about bashing brothers who are involved in this, but it's what the Prophet ﷺ taught. خيركم خيركم لأهله. The best amongst you are those who are best to their families. Man, there is just so much that can be said about that statement. The nobility of a man is to be measured by how good they are to their family members. That is just, that gives you chills, subhanallah. So you look at these stats, and they're very sad, and we just want to make sure that we become a voice for the voiceless, that we speak on their behalf, that we want to say that, look, we're here. But at the same time, if we can help it, we also don't want to isolate the others, and we say, look, we can also help you as well, inshallah.
And I'm so glad that you bring that up, Sheikh Fazaga, because yes, a lot of times it's really easy to see perpetrator, victim, and just think like, this is the bad person and this is the victim. And yes, that, not taking away from the victim and their suffering at all in any way. But we also have to maybe step back and look and see that a lot of times the perpetrators themselves are victims of, just witnessing domestic abuse as children, or even being victims to it themselves. And we'll talk about that, when we get into risk factors, but it's a cycle, so they're seeing that, they've experienced it, and that's what they've learned, and that's how they end up perpetrating it. So in a way, they're victims as well. And that's why it's really important for us to have these conversations and to step in and help both parties, inshallah.
Nice. Well said.
Absolutely. I think it's important to think of abuse as a cycle, because it can help, especially if you're an outsider looking in, have a little bit of understanding of the dynamics that are happening and where people are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these again are general statistics, but just to highlight again how prevalent intimate partner violence is in our society, our larger society. 1 in 4 women, nearly 1 in 4 women have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner during their lifetime, and 1 in 7 men. Yeah. And when we say severe physical violence, that's relating to more of the physical violence. Maybe a weapon was involved, a knife or a gun. Maybe someone was punched or kicked or pushed up against the wall or slammed into a door. That's what is referred to as more severe physical violence.
And I think we touched a little bit on that just a minute ago with risk factors, but I think, it's important to kind of talk about what kind of creates this atmosphere or situation where domestic abuse does occur. So if we're looking at the perpetrator, it can be that they are excessively dependent or possessive towards their partner. Maybe they're just unable to express emotion, and the only emotion that they're really able to express really well is anger. A lot of times too, they exhibit really poor communication skills, and they're not able to kind of verbalize how they're feeling. The only way that they do it is by being angry or threatening, harm. You can, there's also the having unrealistic expectations of their spouse and what they consider to be a marriage, and what, it's just unrealistic. And so that kind of puts them in a place where they're like, well, you're not doing this and this, and they're kind of in that aggressive role. There's also just having, this is really interesting, so they can have maybe a lack of self-control, but in the same point, they're expecting really rigid rules and restrictions on their family, and they put really strict boundaries for what is expected of their family. If you flip it to the victim, a lot of times some of these risk factors will look like that the victim is just really having really low self-esteem. That's one of the big ones. And a lot of times that occurs because that victim has been told over and over that they're stupid, or they're just inadequate, incompetent, things like that. And they internalize it. And not only do they have low self-esteem as a result, but then they don't have the confidence in themselves to feel like they can take responsibility and take actions in order to get out of that relationship or that marriage. And another one, which we kind of mentioned just a little bit ago, which is, and this is for both the victim and the perpetrator, but like we said before, it's a cycle. And so being a witness, growing up in a family where that's been exhibited, where they've seen that, whether the victim's seeing their mom, in many cases, like being okay and staying with the abuse, or the perpetrator may be seeing their dad or their mom abuse, and do that kind of behavior. So they're seeing that, or they're experiencing it themselves as children. So those are some of the risk factors that, just look for. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Sheikh Fazaga.
Yeah, so remember, when we speak about risk factors, the point is not to excuse the behavior. Okay, so when you speak about, people who are 1, 2, and 3, or who exhibit 1, 2, and 3, like you said, they are unable to express their emotions. The only emotion that they know is anger. The point here is not to excuse that behavior. Here, the attempt is to explain. And if we are able to explain, then maybe we can manage it better. Maybe then we can address it better. So please do not misunderstand risk factors to be justification for the behavior. That behavior is absolutely not justifiable whatsoever. And I also want to let our viewers know that if you have a question, please, as you're watching us on YouTube, inshallah, use that live chat box and send us questions, and inshallah we will get to your questions. And sometimes I'll just interject and read you one of these questions, because I think that as you're talking, certain things that you say resonate with the listeners, and they want, why don't you spend some more time on this one about it. So we have, somebody's asking here, they said, can you also please talk about emotional abuse as well? And they made sure to say, please, 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 please. It's like, what? So, if this is something that this individual is going through, may Allah ease your pain, Ya Rabbal Alameen. I may Allah bring peace to your family. And I was just hoping that you two would say more about emotional abuse.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm really glad that they brought that up, because emotional abuse is one of the hardest ones to recognize, because it can be so subtle at the beginning, and just maybe things like jokingly saying things that are hurtful, maybe disrespecting that person, especially in front of their friends, or they can maybe kind of just dismiss their ideas, dismiss their thoughts, dismiss whatever contribution that they may bring, just be like, oh, you don't know how to do this, or I'm surprised that you were able to figure that out. Oh, well, look, this person's trying to have, an insightful conversation, or things like that. It's just a constant, and it builds up. So it's just a constant kind of attack that that can seem maybe like a joke at first, but it really does, you know, get to a serious point. And a lot of times, the really important thing is that emotional abuse can be kind of the precursor to the, you know, more severe types of abuse, such as physical. So a lot of times it will start as emotional, it'll start as psychological, and that will kind of be the precursor to becoming more physical.
Yeah, I think with emotional abuse, a part of it sometimes is simply the threat of physical violence as well. And so that makes me think of violence. So if someone is threatening, I will hurt you if you do this, if you leave the house, if you spend money, if you go visit your friends or your family, that is considered emotional abuse because it's creating control in the relationship and it's creating fear in the relationship. Criticism is another very big one, and I think Suha touched on that. For example, if you did the dishes, but it wasn't to the standard of this person, and they criticize you, or they might criticize the way you look, they might criticize your body, they criticize the way you talk. And it can be even small things that start to build up, and that's where the self-esteem part comes in that we have spoken to as well, because then it's almost like an emotional battering where it really breaks you down and can make your self-esteem very low, because if you're hearing constant criticism, constant anger, constant control, it doesn't allow you to feel healthy and whole as a person.
And I really like what you are saying. And I think that somehow there is a link between verbal abuse and emotional abuse, because usually words are what we use in order to inflict that emotional abuse. And sometimes we also, what we do is that we withhold love. You act very cold, you act very, you know, towards a person that as if they do not exist. And you know, and I just love the idea of words can really, you know, crush our spirits, and it can really, you know, lift our spirits. And we want our words to be deliberate, we want them to be thoughtful, we want them to be considerate, that how is what I am about to say, how is it going to impact the people who are around me. And you've got to really really love the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if you remember, you know, I like to repeat this statement a lot. You know, this idea of the Quran is a very brave book that is read by a lot of cowards, where the Quran is not afraid of addressing these issues, you know, bringing it to the forefront and talking about it. Yet, as sometimes as readers of the Quran, we don't necessarily pay as much attention to these topics as the Quran as the Quran does. And I'm sorry, I did not mean to, you know, just get us stuck in this place. But like I said, some of these topics are resonating with the viewers, and that's why I thought I would just bring them up. So we want to make sure that we go through the presentation, please. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think if it's more important to talk about some things over other things, we want to be receptive to the listeners in the audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you know, I think even thinking about emotional abuse within the cycle of abuse, maybe we can use an example of what emotional abuse would look like with the cycle of abuse. And so when we talk about the cycle of abuse, we have it here in a graph of where it looks like a circle, and I think, or well, kind of an oval, and that's a very accurate picture, because abuse will start with tensions starting to rise, starting to build. And then there'll be an incident that occurs. And that's where it's more visual, or it's more impactful in that moment. And then typically what will happen is after the incident, there's a moment of reconciliation. So that's where the partner who perpetrated the abuse will come in and say, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. I didn't say that. It didn't come out the way I meant it. Or you're thinking too much about it. I didn't mean it. I love you, and let's stay together. I'm sorry. I'll change. I'll never do this again. And then there's a period of what's called the honeymoon phase, where things are great. There's no tensions. There's no physical violence, there's no emotional violence, there's no psychological violence. And unfortunately, that calm period does not last very long or forever, and the tensions start to rise again. And so, with an example of emotional abuse, this will look like potentially blame starts to enter back into the relationship, criticism starts to enter back into the relationship, the guilt trips will enter. There's a term called gaslighting even, and that's a very popular term these days. And gaslighting means when you experience something or think something is happening and the other person says, no, that's not at all, that's not what's happening. And so it makes you feel kind of crazy sometimes, like maybe I'm making this into a bigger deal than it is. And then it leads back into a bigger incident where maybe it's a verbal altercation or a physical altercation. Suha, is there anything I'm missing with that?
No, thank you. You covered it so well. I think one point that I want to add to that is, especially for 3 and 4, those are like, it's important to pay attention to those, because at first, when, the relationship first starts, those tend to be between incidents, you're going to have a greater amount of time, but then that cycle starts to get wound up and tighter until you get to a point where no longer is there like a gap of time. It's just going from, attack to attack to attack. Also, a lot of times with the reconciliation and the calm, that's where the perpetrator comes and they're like, oh, I really didn't mean it. And the victim starts to feel like, oh yes, okay, it's fine, he's great or she's great, and they didn't mean it, it was just a one-time thing. And that's where they kind of end up getting stuck in that cycle again, because they end up staying. But yeah, I just wanted to really add that a lot of times that cycle starts out being kind of big, and it just starts getting tighter and tighter as the relationship continues and as the abuse gets more severe.
I'm really tempted to say something, but I want us to go through the presentation, because there is really some good information there. So please do carry on.
So there are some standard warning signs that someone is the victim of domestic abuse. And people who might have friends or family members who are experiencing domestic abuse, you can know what the warning signs are to look for in people who might be experiencing this. And so I'll cover a few, and then I'll pass it over to Suha. So for physical abuse, they may have unexplained marks or injuries that might look like bruises, swelling. Maybe they have broken bones, and it's not explained by a very rational or reasonable excuse or reason. They may constantly seem worried about upsetting their partner, like maybe they're having to walk on eggshells all the time. And even you as a family or friend member might feel like you have to walk on eggshells too. They make excuses for their partner's behavior. Maybe they seem reserved or distant. So one sign of abuse is the perpetrator will want to isolate the victim from friends and family in order to exert greater control over this person. So something that you might see is if a friend or family member starts to kind of go inward, remain quiet, or even no longer attend events.
Another one is just that they're extremely jealous or possessive, and that goes back to the whole notion of really domestic abuse comes down to control. They just care about having control of that person, and so they're going to be a lot more jealous, which can sometimes be taken as, oh, it's endearing, he just is really jealous. But if it becomes extreme, then that's something to be on the lookout for. A lot of times you'll see is that they'll stop spending time with their family or friends, and that's also just a way of exerting control, because they're cutting out that social circle, that support system, people that might notice and say, hey, listen, things aren't right, what's going on? And so the victim feels so dependent that they just want to, first of all, they're dependent on the perpetrator. Second of all, they don't have a support system to go to. And lastly, you're going to see that they're more depressed or anxious, or maybe display changes in their personality. And I think this is really important because, you know, if you've ever seen symptoms or signs in somebody close or a family member or a friend, if you've ever tried and made that really difficult step of going to that person and saying, hey, listen, you know, I don't like the way that this person is treating you, or you're going to get that very defensive, like, no, this person is great. They didn't mean it. They were just joking, or they're going to get very defensive. And so a really good way to kind of approach somebody who maybe you may suspect is in a domestic abuse relationship is to come to that person and say, hey, listen, I've noticed that you've changed a little bit. You know, you're not like you used to be. Your personality's changed a little bit, and kind of approaching it from that perspective, where they maybe they won't take that at first, but they'll reflect and they'll kind of take that as, wait, did I change? And it just will kind of trigger them to introspect and, you know, look at the situation from a non-defensive stance. So just thought I'd add that there, because I think that's really important. Sometimes we hear that and we're like, I know somebody, or I feel like I've seen these things, but how do I approach that person without it being awkward or offensive?
Mm-hmm. And I would, you know, if you're worried that a friend or family member that you know might be experiencing domestic abuse, to try to talk to them gently, like Suha discussed, but also in a safe place alone, and maybe not ask them in front of their partner. Because if you bring something like this up in front of who might be perpetrating the abuse, um, it could escalate the violence at home for the person you're worried about.
And I just jump in here. Sorry, Suham. Just
No,
jumping in here as an imam, because we get some of these cases. And as you know, clergy, generally speaking, imams, we are the first point that people usually seek help from. And here is, you know, in case we have any other imam out there, and that is the way that we respond to people is absolutely very, very crucial. Just give you one example. A sister calls in and she tells the imam, my husband just hit me. And please remember, we are talking about sisters being the recipients of abuse, because it's 85%. So most likely it is actually the sister that is calling. So she calls in and she says, you know, my husband hit me. And when I do these trainings for imams, I say, so I call you and I say, I'm the sister. I said, my husband just hit me. What is your first response to that? Because your first response to her is going to determine how the rest of the conversation going to go. So I remember somebody is just going to say, oh, what did you do? And the minute you say, what did you do? As if they're saying that, is there a justification for what happened? Mm-hmm. A better response would be, my husband just hit me. A better response would be, are you okay? Do you feel safe? Do you need help? And when we do that, you become the concern. You're the one that's calling me. So I want to be concerned about your well-being. I want to make sure that you're safe. I want to make sure that you are in a good place. And then we will talk about everything else. But safety is going to be, but see what that does is just that first question is very comforting, because I'm saying that I am concerned about you. I am not trying to justify or explain what just took place. I said, are you okay? So again, I say words are really, really important. They're very powerful. And the better we use them, I think that, you know, the better souls we are going to have. And like I said, you know, the rest of the presentation is actually really nice. So I want to make sure that we
I'm so glad
move on to the rest of it.
Sheikh Fazaga. I think because that really accounts for why there's such a discrepancy in why people don't report, why women don't come forward, because they're often blamed. They feel like they're guilted, or it's like, well, it's your fault, or they're shamed. And so that it's really important to kind of have that conversation and to be aware when you are in talking to somebody or somebody's coming to you with something like that.
And so, and this is just for people. I tell people, look, when there is abuse going on, the first thing that actually gets out of the house, or the first thing that leaves the person, is their sense of self-respect. I mean, just imagine having to tell somebody, like, oh, he or she slapped me. They just spit on my face, or they kicked me. They called me all kind of names. And here I am, so helpless that there is nothing that I can do about it because of whatever reason. So what happens is that the first thing that we lose is self-respect. And you know what happens when we lose self-respect? I mean, that's like, you're talking about damage, you're talking about emotional damage, psychological damage. Just imagine an individual who's going to continue life and there is no sense of self-respect. So sometimes people just find this so difficult to come forward and say, nobody's going to say, I lost self-respect. But everything that I'm telling you is, they spit on my face and I didn't do anything. They slapped me and I didn't. They called me names and I didn't do anything. They told me and they, and so please, we want to come from a place of understanding, inshallah.
There's definitely that judgment, and that's part of the reason why some women specifically will say, you know what, I would rather take the abuse than lose that, than lose the self-respect, or then be judged in the community, or be shamed into feeling like it's my fault, or why didn't you do anything, or especially when it comes to kids, and it's like, well, look at what you put your kids through. And so that's part of the reason that women end up staying, unfortunately. I do want to add to just your point, Emily, when you mentioned with just how to approach, somebody who maybe who you suspect. Of course, you should be very careful about doing that in front of the perpetrator, and expect that if that perpetrator suspects that you are, trying to talk to the victim and trying to get, and I'm going to just use the, refer to it as women. If you're trying to, talk to his wife and, try to give her resources to get out, he's going to do everything he can to cut you out of that person's life. And I think it's really important that we, just as bystanders, one of the things that we can do is stay persistent. Even if we get cut off, just stay as much as we can in that person's life, because she might not be ready at that point, but there's going to come a point where she's ready, and you might be the only person who might provide that out for her.
Nice.
So just wanted to add that.
Well said.
Yeah. And something, while you two were talking, I was thinking about is the self-esteem aspect too of domestic abuse, and how that can keep someone in a relationship. And maybe you might start to think, maybe I am stupid, or maybe I am ugly, and maybe I deserve this, and maybe this is just what the relationship is. This is just what I deserve. This is who I am. And I want to just strongly state that you never deserve to be treated in an abusive way, whether it's emotional abuse or physical abuse or financial abuse, or you never deserve it. And it's not okay if it's happening.
Got it.
Thank you for that.
All right.
So I know we're coming up on time, so we'll just quickly go over some of these tools of domestic abuse. And we've gone over some of them. So at the center of the wheel, you see power and control. As Suhas kind of highlighted throughout the evening, the abuse is really centered around maintaining power and control. And ways that can happen using children, I think, is one that maybe we haven't spoken about yet, especially within a family system, of guilt tripping someone to stay because of children in the family, or using children as pawns almost in a game of violence, controlling children too as a way to kind of keep someone in, of if you leave, I will take the kid and you won't have the kids. Isolation is one we've covered. Emotional abuse we've covered. controlling all decisions is a very big one too. And I think that can mean controlling access even to things like finances or transportation. And a big one is minimizing, denying, and blaming. So instead of taking ownership of being a perpetrator of abuse, someone who is using a tool of domestic abuse might blame the victim for what's happening to them. And we covered that a little bit as well. I think.
I mean, these are unfortunately, you know, what we're hoping for here is that people become better informed, and the better informed we are, the better choices we make. And I think coming from a place of understanding also puts us at a better place of finding what are the solutions. So something that we really do, and of course you know this, both of you as clinicians, is that psychoeducation is really important, making people aware of what is going on. Because once people are enlightened, they start paying attention to these tools. They say, you know what, I can actually relate. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can see, you know, he or she does this all the time. Now, like Suha said, sometimes, you know what, you can see it, but the other person does not. And they say that in these cases, it is usually best when the decision is made by the survivor themselves. You know, they say that like, I want to do this. Their recovery is much better than being pushed out. You know, that getting them to the point where they make that decision, I think is just absolutely wonderful. So in case you're thinking as to why are we sharing these tools, it is so that you can, you know, you can see what is going on. I'm looking forward to the next 2 slides.
Suha, you want to cover myths?
Sure. So we kind of touched a little bit on it, but there's a lot of myths that surround domestic abuse. And one of the main ones that I hear often is that it's usually people of lower socioeconomic or lower education are the ones who are victim. That's just a crime for within that demographic. And that is so not true. Domestic abuse, unfortunately, it hits people from all kinds of socioeconomic, educational levels. Everybody's susceptible to it. And that's what the research shows. It shows that, women of all different backgrounds, and I'm going to say women because that has been just the statistic that they go off of. They can have a great job, they can have great education, they can be from a higher socioeconomic status, and still they are victims of domestic abuse. So another one is that a lot of people will say, well, if the victim doesn't leave, then the situation must be okay, it's tolerable. And we kind of talked a little bit about that. Sometimes the price of leaving is so much more, to the victim at least, is so much more damaging than staying, that they would rather stay. You know, if leaving means that their reputation is gonna kind of get trampled on, or if they're gonna be judged in the community, or if they just feel like they're not going to have a support system once they leave, then they might be like, you know what, I would rather stay in that than leave. Not because it's tolerable, not because it's easy, but because they are scared of leaving. And I don't know if you want to add something to that myth, or debunking that myth, Sheikh Fazaga or Emily.
Okay. I was once attending a day-long workshop, and I remember one of the survivors of domestic violence spoke. And the very first one, poor and uneducated, she was actually a judge. And check this out. She was a family law judge. And her job was actually to send perpetrators to jail. This was what she did daytime. But she herself was actually a victim of domestic violence. And I remember hearing that story because she was a living example. It's not people who are uneducated. It's not people who are poor. Of all people, I knew this best, yet I myself, I was trapped into this. And unfortunately, many times, these are people that we would deem to be of, high social status in the community. These are people who come to the masjid all the time. These are board members. These are, but the reality of it by the end of the day is it transcends all these, so-called, socioeconomic, ethnic, lines there.
And if you think about it, just the sheer numbers, there's no way that, just because of, look at the percentage, look at how many people are affected by it. It doesn't make sense that this is something restricted to a certain class or a certain education level. So it's just really good to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I think the last point also is, as I'm sorry, we're coming to a close here, but the impact of the coronavirus and the lockdown has not been good for victims of domestic abuse. See, he or she, they left the house to do work, or they themselves actually left the house to do work. Well, now since the lockdown, what has happened is that that person is always there. And I remember, reminds me of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that, what, and so how you used this word earlier, said that some people, he said that the worst type of people are those who have um, uh, um, they have this idea of unexplained or undue rigidity on their families. And the people said, who would do that, O Prophet of Allah? He said, they are the kind of people that when they come in, those who are talking stop talking. And when the kids are playing, they stop playing. And those who are visible, they become invisible. People just go. And then he said, but once that person leaves, then everybody is relaxed and everybody is laughing. They find delight and they find laughter. And it is so sad. And I think there is an equivalent saying here in English where say, some people bring happiness wherever they go, and some people bring happiness whenever they go. And what you see here is this idea of your presence is the source of my tension. Your presence is the source of my pain. Your presence is why there is so much tension in our household. But the minute you leave, everybody is chill, walking on eggshells when you are there. But the minute you leave, that's when we find happiness. So COVID, unfortunately, has not been good for people who are suffering from um, domestic abuse.
I'm so happy you brought that up because COVID has really increased the rates of reports and people calling in and people seeking out shelters. And just for the sake of time, I'd love to showcase the last slide, which is the resource slide, because there is a national domestic abuse hotline, and we have the number listed, 800-799-SAFE. And you can call this number and it will connect you with someone to talk to. You can also visit their website. If you type in National Domestic Violence Hotline, they have a website. Locally in Memphis, we have Kindred Place, which offers services for the entire family. It has children groups, it has groups for women, it has groups for men. And then we listed Sheikh Fazaga as a resource because really any imam within the Memphis community, or if you're not in Memphis and you want to reach out to your imam, please reach out to resources in your community that you trust, because these are people here to talk to. And even, Suha and I here in Memphis, we can help connect you with resources here.
Yeah, and a really great work for both of you, ladies, Suha and Emily. And the most important part is we are here to be of much help to our community as much as we can. And the most important part is, just talking to my brothers out there, if you happen to be the perpetrator, hitting a woman does not make you more of a man. I remember I gave a khutbah one time, a Friday sermon, and I spoke about, what, you really need to stop this. And a brother came to me and he said, last week after the khutbah, I went to my wife. I have not been kind to her for the past 22 years. And I went and I apologized for what I have done to her. And I remember I told him, I said, you are more of a man today than you have been for the past 22 years. The idea of raising your hand, the idea of just being verbally abusive, or, it may really give you the illusion of control, but the reality of it is it really is an expression of weakness. Anger does not justify violence. Many times people would tell you, I got a ticket, I was so mad and I did not deserve it. I say, well, did you hit the officer? No, I didn't hit the officer. Well, it means that you can really practice self-control, but it seems like you only practice self-control when the other person is stronger than you are. But it seems like you use the idea of I snapped, I lost it, when the person is weaker than you are. So don't give me that, you know what, I lose it, or I'm just angry, or that really is not, that is not an excuse. There is no Islamic justification for this type of behavior. So if you are out there using Islam, thinking that Islam gives you the license to do that, please stop it. Something does not become Islamic because you added the word Islamic to it. That is not how, that is not how it works. Unfortunately, it was not a very pleasant topic, but it was a very, very important topic. And I am glad that you, Suha, and Emily joined me in this process. We have people who are very grateful to both of you and saying that they feel understood because of what you said. They feel that they have been taken seriously, and they have been, they feel the support because of what you have shared with them. And that is really nice. So on behalf of these people, thank you. And just one last point is, you know what, we've been talking about suicide, we've been talking about stress, we've been talking about depression, and now we're talking about domestic violence. Do you have anything positive maybe we can share with the people? Do we have anything coming up that maybe is
We just might.
okay? What do we have?
I think we're going to be talking about happiness next time, just to
Oh,
switch it up a little bit and bring in a mental health topic that is happy.
A little more
yes.
lighthearted.
Yes.
Yes, so happiness is our topic for next week. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We absolutely loved being with you. Hopefully, you found this to be informative. And as always, we will be here next week, inshallah. And our topic shall be happiness. May Allah make you happy. For all the people who are going through difficult times, may Allah ease your pain. For all the families that are not doing well, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring gentleness, bring compassion and love into your family. And until we see you next time, we say so long and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.